Welcome everybody to this evening's Manchester Classical Association public lecture for our series, where we welcome ancient Greek historian and YouTube sensation, Dr. Roel from Lincoln College, Oxford, where he's currently a Derby Fellow in Ancient History, and he's working on lots of projects. He's an ancient Greek historian with a research specialism in ancient Greek war, which is why you're all here, and its relation not just to warfare but to social, political and cultural history, which is extremely important for anyone who knows the ancient world. He's got a wide array of publications around Greek military tactics, Athenian democracy, Spartan traditions, Persian kingship, Herodotus, Max Weber, and the way modern scholarship has shaped all of our understanding of Greek warfare and continues to shape it. His publications include his most recent book, published with Brill 2023, so very recently, Between Miltiades and Moltke, Early German Studies of Greek Military History, and his first book in 2018 with Brill also on Classical Greek Tactics, A Cultural History. But you've not come here to listen to me speak, so I'm going to hand straight over to Roel to share his screen and present us with his talk this evening, after which there'll be a chance for questions and discussion with our speaker. So over to you on Spartan super soldiers.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm going to try and see if my presentation works. Can we all see this? Is this good?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. So Spartan Super Soldiers as a title in a series on myth might sound slightly tendentious. The idea for this paper came from, or for this talk came from a friend of mine sharing with me, I'm going to try to see if, yeah, there we are, sharing with me this image from an upcoming game from Paradox Interactive called Millennia. This is a 4X game, so you get to play different historical figures and you get to build their civilization from scratch. And this isn't anything to do with checking their historical accuracy of this rather bizarre image, but rather to focus on their description of the Spartan as a warrior, which is featured in the game. Elite warriors, it says, of great fame, Spartans are fearsome on the battlefield. And this, when I saw this, reminded me of a game that I used to play when I was a teenager, Rome Total War, in which Spartan hoplites are a faction, or rather a unit that you can train if you're playing as the Greeks. Which are similarly described in a line that always stuck with me through the years of learning about Greek warfare myself. The line highlighted here, Spartan hoplites are trained from infancy to be nothing but soldiers. They are perfect soldiers and nothing else. Something really sort of essential about this, which in fact, when this game got a sequel, or rather a comprehensive rebuild of the same setting 10 years later in 2013, they rewrote the blurb. They got the Spartans their own brand new faction. They're now a playable faction. Spartan hoplites is just one of the many Spartan units you can train, but their description remains something very similar. These men, it says at the top, know nothing but war, and they are rightly feared by all. And then it continues at the bottom that they are conditioned from the age of 7 for a life of campaign and dedicated to full-time military training. The Spartans exceptionally well drilled and masters of their weaponry and equipment. So even though they completely rewrote the idea of what the Spartan hoplites were supposed to sound like, a lot of these points they kind of have that in common, and these games have that idea shared between them. And this is also something you see in different franchises that might not have anything to do with the ancient world. Most famously, the Halo franchise, in which the genetically modified super soldier that you see here on the left is known as a Spartan. There's a whole class of them. And in the tie-in novels, there's a lovely scene from that I've cited here from the tie-in novel Halo: The Fall of Reach, which came out in 2001, in which the children who are being sort of abducted into this program, who are being made into super soldiers, are taught about the Spartans from which they get their name. And they're described here, the key section is here, that the AI explained to the children that the 300 that they saw on this holographic reconstruction were Spartans, and they were the best soldiers who had ever lived. They had been trained to fight since they were children, and no one could beat them. This is, again, something really essential that is similar to the depiction in Rome Total War earlier, or actually later than this novel was originally published. And you have similar things all over popular culture. This is from a description of the Spartans as they're featured in a tabletop game called Hail Caesar. And once again, we have a description that is sort of in very explicit and strong terms describing the idea of these Spartans as something quite different and something quite superior to other warriors of their day, or even other warriors in history in general. Lifelong military service, it says, was in fact the defining condition of a Spartan citizen who could expect to spend his life between 20 and 60 in a stage of constant training or active campaigning. And naturally, this produced an incredibly well-disciplined, fit and brave force. I mean, these kind of terms where you're basically seeing this idea developing of the Spartan super soldier. I think from these examples, and there are many more that I could cite, and I'm sure you've all played games and seen movies and read books in which similar descriptions of the Spartans abound, they have a certain picture of the Spartan in common. And this picture is very heavily focused on the idea that these are full-time professional soldiers, first of all. They do nothing but soldiering, as we've seen. This is all they do. This is all they've done their entire lives. They're trained continuously, so even when they're not actively engaged in warfare, they are constantly being prepared for it. And there's this obsession with the notion that this starts in childhood. And often, you get citations of the tidbit that it starts at age 7, that they're dragged away from their homes, dragged away from their families. You see a bit sort of a moving scene in the opening montage of the movie 300, for instance, where a small child is taken away by force from his mother in order to be indoctrinated and inducted into this training program, and that this continues throughout their adult lives. And as a result of that, in these pop cultural depictions, of course, these Spartans are exceptionally skilled. They are better at fighting than anyone else, better with their weapons, better in formations, better with all sorts of aspects of military behavior, and they're uniquely dedicated. It's because they don't know anything but warfare. They are also exceptionally committed to the kind of military causes that they get sent out to fight for. And as a result of these things, I don't just sort of noted that at the bottom there, but as a result of these things, they're also, and this is repeatedly stressed in the examples I've just given you, scary. Their enemies are afraid of them because they don't have these same kind of factors themselves. They're not trained in the same way. They don't have this lifelong dedication to the art. And so when they're encountering Spartans, they are terrified because these guys are going to be superior to them. This is a common picture. This is the idea of the Spartan super soldier that exists in pop culture, and I think it's pretty universal. And I would speculate that to the people who create these kinds of things, that write these games and the movies and books, there is something about Sparta which is almost like a thought experiment. It's not a real historical society so much as an idea. What would you get if you created the perfect warrior society, a society in which the citizens, the adult men who are, in other citizens sometimes drafted for war or made to serve as a militia, or only some of them become soldiers? What if you made an entire citizen body into soldiers only and dedicated their entire adult lives to nothing but warfare? What would you get if you tried that? And that is something that is clearly sort of behind, especially something like the Halo franchise, where you see the idea of when you create a genetically modified super soldier that does nothing but going off to fight aliens for the human Federation, then you have to give them that name. They're closer to Spartans than they are to anything in human history. They're closer to the Spartans than they are to anything else that we can relate to, that we can connect to. So the Spartans become this sort of perfect template. They become this idea of the super soldier that is the product of an ultimate warrior culture, of something that is singular and unique and pure, something that is nothing but warfare. Now, obviously, as I said, putting this talk into a series on myth, when I ask the question, is this true? You're already kind of predisposed to think probably not. And of course, my answer will be, as we'll see in the half an hour that follows or so, that I actually think this is greatly overstated. But it's not without foundation, even in the ancient sources themselves. So we do have to kind of recognize that this isn't something that these people have come up with out of enjoyment of the idea, because they want to have these super soldiers, because they want to imagine that the super soldiers of the future are something similar to these Spartans from the past, or that they imagine that if you're having, populating a game world full of different units from the ancient world, that of course the Spartans are going to be, a cut above everybody else. They don't just do that for fun. They are working with something that the sources and therefore the scholarship are telling them. But this we have to imagine. When we are reading about the ancient Spartans from Greek sources, all of those sources are coming from outside of Sparta and looking at it, and they are trying to describe Sparta in a way that would make it make sense to them. And one of the things they have to try and make sense of is the fact that the Spartans appear to be really, really good at fighting battles. And this is something that is, incontrovertible. I can't deny it. The Spartans do win a lot of battles in the open field. In fact, in the period between about 575, we don't know exactly when this begins, but around the sort of the second quarter of the 6th century BC, and 371 and their catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Leuctra, between those brackets, in those 2 centuries, the Spartans seem to win about every pitched battle they fight, more or less. This doesn't mean they always win in war. I mean, there are many different kinds of engagements, and sometimes the Spartans lose, including entire wars. But in terms of pitched battles, they seem to be completely undefeated. And you have to imagine, therefore, that when the Greeks are thinking about this, and when Greek authors are writing about this, this is what they have to explain, right? They have this problem of how are they doing that? How are the Spartans able to beat everyone else all the time? Why can't we top that? Why can't we confront them effectively? Until 371, when it turns out suddenly it is possible. And so they are trying to find some way to cope with this. And one of the things that they consistently come up with is this very same idea that we saw in these pop cultural representations, that the Spartans have trained their whole lives for this, that they started from early on, and that therefore they specialize in it and they're better at it than anyone else. So already in Thucydides, in the end of the 5th century, he says that, he has his speaker Pericles explain that there's a big difference between Athens and Sparta. He says, our rivals, the Spartans, from their very cradles pursue courage through laborious training. But at Athens, we live exactly as we please. Now, his argument is actually that the Athenians are just as courageous as the Spartans. They're just as brave in battle. But there's already this understanding here that the Spartans are doing something in their upbringing, something that they dedicate themselves to in their youth that makes them into fearsome warriors. So exactly that idea that we saw in these later, so the blurbs from the games and the books and everything else. Xenophon has a speaker say they carry on their training, these Spartans, from their very boyhood with a view to war by land. The idea that the Spartans specialize in this one thing, fighting on land, that is what they do. They started when they were little kids. They never stop. That's why they're so good at it. That's why they always win. Although he does also remark that one of the reasons why people like to side with Sparta in land warfare is they have the biggest army, which is an interesting caveat to the idea that this is all about their skills. But this is clearly something that was quite widespread in his day, this understanding that the Spartans specialized from childhood, and that makes them particularly effective. Aristotle, when he describes the Spartan constitution in all its glory and its failings, actually goes on and on about this fact that the Spartans dedicate themselves to one thing and one thing only, and that their entire state, let alone their education system, is devoted to warfare and nothing else. He says the entire system of laws is directed towards one part of virtue only, military valor. And because they do this because this is useful for conquest. This makes them into these conquering, all-powerful land force. They did not know, he says, speaking, looking back from a period in which Sparta has already diminished in power, they did not know how to live a life of leisure and had been trained in nothing else but mastering the art of war. So these are the images that we get from the ancient sources themselves. They are trying to explain this idea of why did the Spartans win all the time by saying, look, I mean, that's just what they do. They do nothing else. They're over-specializing, right? They're over-specializing to the point where, yeah, they can do that one thing really well, but if they have to do anything else, they won't be able to. So that's the price, but you get something in return. So that's the image we get. And the image then is very heavily reliant on this same link, as I mentioned, between starting young, this upbringing, this education, and specializing in one particular skill, fighting. But we do actually know something about the Spartan education. So we can test this. We can ask ourselves, is it really so focused on being good at fighting in battle, fighting in war? Does it really create super soldiers? And we have, in fact, a contemporary source, Xenophon, who is already on this page right here, who not only saw this firsthand when he went to Sparta and lived there for a good time, or nearby with his friends in among the Spartan leadership, but also sent his own sons through the Spartan education system. So no one really should have a better sense of what this education system entailed than Xenophon, of all the authors that survived from antiquity. And so we can test this. We can ask ourselves, what is Spartan education like? And it turns out that when you look at the actual system, it is perhaps not quite as military as we would imagine when we think of these Spartans specializing in nothing but war and training for it from childhood. The first thing that I should mention, and this is almost an aside, is that Jean Ducas mentioned in his very important book on this Spartan education, this idea that they're taken away from their parents and put in barracks when they're 7 years old and made to sort of live in this sort of military boarding school. That's completely untrue. We have plenty of evidence from the sources that they go home at night, at the very least, that they spend probably breakfast, probably a good part of the day, and certainly the night with their parents at home, and not just when they're little kids, but in fact into adulthood. Many of the anecdotes that we hear about Spartans wouldn't make sense if the children weren't around the house until they were adults and moved out to be able to establish their own household. So as Ducat said, we should not believe what can often be read, that the boy was taken away from his family, which he puts already in scare quotes, because it is something that is really quite a cliche of scholarship, but probably not true. The boys would only spend part of the day among other boys. So what were they doing there? Well, Xenophon tells us that there were some things that started at 7, including a lot of deprivation. These Spartan kids were made to undergo a denial of a lot of creature comforts that were supposed to make them harder and willing to put up with all sorts of discomforts. So, for instance, they were made to not wear shoes. They could only have one item of clothing in all seasons, which meant that they would be enduring themselves or inuring themselves to endure extreme cold in winter and extreme heat in summer. They had to sort of endure all sorts of things that they couldn't have, which were meant to sort of toughen them up, essentially, meant to make them willing to endure these kinds of things later on in adulthood as well. So they were made to, things were taken away from them. But what we don't hear from him is a sense that they actually had to do anything, that they actually had to be trained in any way, and that they were actually forced to undergo any kind of training regime or instruction. Exercise, according to Xenophon, starts later, probably around age 12, where he says when the boy starts to become a lad, so when he hits puberty, presumably, then they start doing exercise. But this is still just exercise. This is gymnastic exercise, general fitness. And then there's, according to Xenophon, a whole host of other duties, but we don't know what they are, that they are subjected to in order to keep them busy. And this is entirely just because he says teenagers are an unruly bunch and they go off and do their own things and become lazy and indulgent. And Lycurgus, the great lawgiver of Sparta, wouldn't let that happen. So he kept them busy. But he doesn't say that this has any other purpose other than keeping them on the straight and narrow, making sure they're dedicating themselves to the public good. But we don't actually know anything about this exercise program. We don't know what it entails. He doesn't say anything explicit about any military side to that. Plutarch, who gives a much later account and is much less trustworthy on this, actually say they do start playing sports from age 7, but he doesn't feature those deprivations. He doesn't say that they were denied things until later. So according to him, they were maybe made to play naked. So he literally uses the word paitsein. So they played around when they were kids naked so that they might endure, the weathers, all weather and all circumstances. But otherwise, they weren't made to do very much and they weren't denied anything until they hit maybe age 12. So the same level of, puberty that Xenophon was talking about. And that is when they started to be denied, the food that they needed to grow and the kind of the clothing and the comforts and the mattresses and the pillows and things like that, and the shoes that Xenophon already mentioned as things that they're supposed to be denied in order to train them in being hardy and being able to endure hardship. According to Plutarch, they also start sleeping in barracks at that point. Again, Xenophon doesn't say anything about this. But Plutarch does suggest, and this is also confirmed by Xenophon, that once they hit 18, once the education is finished, this stops. This entirely just, this no longer happens, and they presumably can go back home. So this idea that they're taken away from their families more or less never to be seen again because they're going into this machine that turns them into super soldiers, no source actually tells us this is the case. All of them do mention that, the education starts at 7 and that they are spending most of their days out of doors with other boys, with other members of their age group. But what they actually do is much more obscure. It's much harder to see. And in fact, the sources contradict each other on it, but neither of them claim that this is anything very rigidly military. Neither of them say that any part of this, in fact, has an explicitly military side. There's no weapons training, there's no formation drill, there's no instruction in military theory or tactics, there's nothing like that. In fact, it's just exercise and this set of deprivation, this set of things that they're not supposed to have, which is supposed to make them more able to put up with the kind of things they might have to put up with on campaign. One thing that I should mention there is that one source, Plato, is the first to mention this, but Plutarch goes into much more detail, and especially Pausanias, so much later sources from the Roman period, that there may have been mock battles, so they may have tried to simulate fighting. But the thing is that Plato, he likes the idea of mock battles as a form of military training, so he goes on about this a bit, and he says that in his ideal state, people would be doing this quite a bit. But they would be doing it with weapons. They would be training, essentially combat conditions. And they would be training that way to act as a unit and to use weapons. And he says the Spartan system isn't sufficient for this because that's not how they do it. And later sources make this explicit, and they say that they basically just have organized fistfights. They get together in groups and they have to push each other physically off a small island, for instance. And this is something that is only attested in late sources, but even if it were true that they were already doing this in the archaic and the classical period, one thing we can say is that this is just not combat. This is essentially just fist fight. This is a big brawl, which may, obviously train these kids to endure pain, to do violence, to try and inspire them to go after the prize of winning these fights. But at the same time, it has basically nothing to do with the practice of warfare. It is just making them do violent stuff to each other in order to kind of condition them to accept danger and to pursue violence as a way of gaining glory. So if any of this is training for war, it is indirect. It is not an immediate way of learning how to be a fighter. And this is, in fact, something that's quite explicit about that system. It doesn't tell you, or none of these sources tell you, that the intention is to make them into good fighters with a sword or with a spear or in formation or carrying a shield or anything else. What the system does, according to Xenophon, and what it takes pride in doing to its little recruits, is to turn out men who are, in his words, more obedient, more respectful, and more strictly temperate than any other education system in the Greek world. And Xenophon actually stresses, in fact, that it's not even that it doesn't have the object of making them into better fighters so much as more obedient and more respectful citizens, but it actually creates a system in which aspects of that moral code, that moral behavior of how to be an upstanding Spartan citizen, are explicitly more important than the features that we might associate with good soldiering. So, for instance, he says that old age, deference to old age, respect for the elderly, is more important and held in greater honor at Sparta than the strength of men in their prime, than the ability of men to fight or to beat opponents in violent combat. The key values of this system, repeated not just by Xenophon but elsewhere, are obedience, deference to the elderly, to their leaders, to the kings, moderation, self-control, the ability to manage your intake, your drink, all these kinds of things, the ability to endure hardship. Endurance, both in the sense of fitness and in the sense of enduring pain, deprivation, shortage of food, shortage of water, heat, cold, these kinds of things. And while a lot of that stuff obviously has military application, it is at best indirectly aimed at turning these little Spartans into soldiers. It is also, and much more importantly, according to these kind of definitions, turning these Spartans into good little citizens. And that is really the main object of this education as analyzed by Ducat and Nigel Kennell and other scholars. In fact, the key skills that the Spartans are made to learn here are not combat, not fighting with a spear or marching in formation. They are reading and writing, poetry, dancing, and especially, and this is something that Plutarch goes on and on about, teaching these kids how to speak like a Spartan. This laconic speech, these pithy little phrases, then we'll fight in the shade, come and get them, these kinds of things are associated with Spartans. And this is how a Spartan is meant to advertise his Spartanness to the outside world. It's a very important thing for them to learn, to speak like a Spartan. And that is something that becomes much more important and is clearly the object of much more attention in this education system than anything as crude as learning how to fight. And indeed, when you look at their later life, when we've heard from all these pop culture narratives that they are in constant training, they never stop training for fighting, they never stop training for warfare, Xenophon explicitly refutes that. He actually says that they are basically just let off the hook when they become adults. So when they hit adulthood at 18 or 20, they're just no longer training. Xenophon says, while absolving adult men from the duty of bestowing further attention on their bodily strength, so even gymnastic training, other Greeks do require them to continue serving in the army. But Lycurgus, his contrast here explicitly in Sparta, and you kind of expect him to go on to say they do still have to keep on working on their bodily strength, but no. Lycurgus established the principle that for citizens of that age, hunting was the noblest occupation, except when some public duty prevented. So if you're a magistrate or if you're sent on some public business, of course, you don't have to hunt. But others have to hunt in order that they might be able to stand the fatigues of soldiering as well as the younger men. So we're talking here about an entire class of adults who obviously are rich, because all Spartans are rich. They're all, wealthy landowners. And the pursuit of such a leisure class is, of course, not hanging around with a bunch of other guys trying to wield a spear properly. No, it is things like hunting, things like going out onto your land and trying to get extra food for your table by hunting together, working in teams to catch hares and things like that, maybe hunting boars if you're in the mountain. So there is no explicit reference here to any kind of training that persists once a Spartan hits adulthood. He is completely liberated from the duty to train, except for the caveat that he should probably keep trying to hunt because hunting is a good way to stay fit. It is only in wartime, Xenophon says, that these Spartans actually train. So there is exercise, but it only applies to armies on campaign. So if you leave Sparta, then you might be required to train every day. The law requires all Spartans, he says, to do gymnastics regularly throughout the campaign. But these are gymnastics, and that is the word that's being used. So these are just general exercises for fitness. And we kind of get the impression from this same quote that actually it's not about sort of rigid military training in which these men are turned into automatons of war and perfect fighters, but rather it's a good way to spend time. It's a bit of fun out of doors with your mates. After the exercises, he says, the senior polemarch, the officer, gives the order by herald to sit down, and then to eat breakfast and to relieve the outposts. And after this, there are amusements and recreations until the evening exercises. So the idea being that these gymnastics in camp, they keep the men from being idle, which is a common problem with armies on campaign, that men have nothing to do, especially when they're besieging somewhere, for instance, or they're waiting for something to happen. And so you keep them busy and you keep them fit. But that is the only time when exercises are required. And they're just, again, as this quote clearly indicates, just general fitness and having a bit of fun and making sure you stay active and you don't get bored and you don't sort of go off and misbehave. Plutarch, frustratingly, actually gives the opposite advice and says that in wartime, they have to do less exercise. He implies that they actually have to do quite a bit of exercise in peacetime. This may be a later development because it explicitly contradicts what Xenophon has already told us. But in his account, they only exercise once during wartime, which may actually have meant that the number of times the Spartans have to exercise has gone down over time, where Xenophon still implies they have to exercise twice a day when they're on campaign. But either way, the important point here is that they only have to exercise, they only have to commit to any kind of training when they're all together on campaign. And this, in fact, makes sense because the Spartans, the Spartiate citizens themselves, may have gone through all kinds of training when they were growing up. They may have gone through all this conditioning that we've seen. But when they're out fighting, they're fighting with a whole bunch of people who never went through that program. They're fighting with the perioikoi, the people who are freeborn from their territory with military obligations, but who are not citizens. They're fighting with freed helots. They're fighting with people who have dropped out of the citizen civic class. And they're fighting with their allies. And those people have not had that kind of upbringing that other people think of as making the Spartans specialized in land warfare. And so if you're going to do any kind of exercises for fitness and general cohesion of the force, you got to do it when the force is already together. You got to do it when they're all together so that you can subject all of them to the same kinds of exercises and hopefully bring all of them to more or less the same level of fitness and effectiveness. But as Stephen Hodkinson has recently pointed out in a very good article about Spartan professionalism or otherwise, campaigning is rare. The idea that the Spartans are always on campaign and always fighting wars is actually really not true. Even when they are fighting wars, only about 10% of the time during the year, only in the summer months, is actually spent on campaign. There are only a few wars where they spend more time abroad fighting, and these are campaigns in which, or these are wars in which they have permanent garrisons stationed outside the borders. So that is when they actually have to campaign maybe a third of the year on average. But generally speaking, the Spartan is not fighting wars all that often, and therefore, if we believe Xenophon, they're also not training all that often. Once they reach adulthood, they're released from training until they're forced to fight and forced to go out and fight on campaign. And even then, that's only a small part of the year. The result of all this, obviously, and this is something that I've already stressed several times, is that this is not a program. This is not going to be a program that is producing very skilled spearmen or swordsmen or anything like that. And in fact, there is hardly any concept like that in any Greek source. They don't seem to recognize the idea of being skilled in the use of weapons, except, for instance, with missiles, with arrows or javelins. What you do see is general fitness. The result that all these authors are proud of, the result that they're saying these Spartans attained with their rigorous training program, is that they become more fit. Not better fighters specifically and directly, but rather just generally more suited to campaigning because they've all gone through this program that makes them do quite a bit of sports. So Xenophon says it would not be easy to find healthier or handier men. Handier here is just like making use of their bodies than the Spartans. For their exercises, he says, train the legs, arms, and neck equally. They don't train spear fighting or sword fighting or anything like that, or marching in formation. No, they train the legs, arms, and neck. It's a balanced exercise regime. Fitness obviously has its uses in war, as does endurance, as does obedience and all these other factors. But it is not a training to be super soldiers so much as a training to be useful when the call comes to fight. This is about citizens being both healthy at home and healthy abroad when they are needed by the community. And Xenophon stresses this again when he describes this idea of an Athenian lamenting that the Athenians don't do anything similar. He says, when will the Athenians adopt the Spartan system of training? Which then makes us ask, what do you mean by that? What is the Spartan system of training? What benefits are they supposed to derive from it? Well, Xenophon tells us they not only neglect to train their bodies, but make fun of those who make the effort. So the Spartan training program that's supposed to be adopted is only going to make them train their bodies. It's only going to make them more fit. That's all it is. And that training program, of course, is for kids. It's not actually something that's continued into adulthood. Unless you're on campaign and you're with everybody else who needs to be equally fit. And so we get some confirmation, actually, of this theory, of this hypothesis that Spartan training doesn't seem to be about warfare. It doesn't seem to be about learning how to be a better fighter. Plato discusses the topic of combat training specifically, hoplomachia, the fighting with weapons. And he says explicitly, or he has one of his speakers say, that the Spartans don't bother with it. Other people hire these drill masters for hire that travel around the Greek world offering to teach people how to fight with weapons, but the Spartans don't use them. And so, his speaker concludes, there must be nothing useful in that. It must be not useful to train with weapons, because if the Spartans don't do it, clearly it's useless for war, because they know everything about war. That's what they specialize in. If they don't bother with combat training, it must be useless. So he says if there were anything in armed combat training, it would not have been overlooked by the Spartans, whose only concern in life is to seek out and practice whatever study or pursuit will give them an advantage over others in war. The implication there obviously is, because the Spartans apparently overlook combat training, it's something that everybody else can dispense with just as much, because it's clearly not important. And the Spartans, whatever it is that they're doing to be so effective, it doesn't involve combat training. And in fact, it doesn't involve much else either, other than the fitness regime that we've seen and the general conditioning of the spirit that has been such an important part of the Spartan upbringing. Xenophon impresses upon the reader the idea that when they see the Spartans and they're really impressed with their military maneuvers and with their capabilities, he wants you to believe that anyone can adopt these. Anyone can do it. It doesn't take long. It's not difficult. He says it's not like that you need a lifetime of training to understand how the Spartan army works. Actually, you can learn it. I've heard some reenactors say you can learn it in 20 minutes. I've tried it with my students. It's great. You can really learn this in about 30 minutes, the Spartan drill system. He says the prevalent opinion that the Laconian infantry formation is very complicated is the very reverse of the truth. The formation is so easy to understand that no one who knows man from man can possibly go wrong. As long as you know how to line up and follow the leader, follow the man in front of you, you can learn how to behave like a Spartan on the battlefield. And it's absolutely true. He goes on to lay out how it works, and it's very straightforward. He says the same thing when he proposes reforms to the Athenian cavalry. This is a system that's easy to pick up. This is not the product of years and years of dedicated training. This is the product of them getting together with the perioikoi when they go on campaign and practicing it for a few days ahead of the fight that's going to happen. This is something that they have to be able to learn on the go rather than preparing for it for years and years throughout childhood, because they just don't have the luxury. When they fight, they always fight together with others, and the others have to learn to do the kind of things that the Spartans are expected to do. So it has to be easy, has to be done quickly. That's all it is. And indeed, when you find Spartans in single combat, or when you find Spartans evenly matched, they don't actually appear to be all that much better than anyone else. And this is a really important thing when you think about this idea that their training is not about combat training. It's just about general fitness and fitting into the mold of these Spartan values. When you have the famous example of the Battle of the Champions in the middle of the 6th century, 300 picked Spartans went up against 300 picked Argives. At the end of that battle, 1 Spartan was left alive, 2 Argives. Apparently, you can more or less match these guys against each other and they come out even. There isn't really any sense that 300 Spartans would easily be able to mop the floor with 300 troops from any other state. They're about even in close combat as long as nothing else interferes with the fight. Individually, these Spartans are not better than others, and nobody is really ever going to think that that's true. During the occupation of Thebes in the 4th century, we are told that the Thebans, who are basically being oppressed by a Spartan occupying force at this point, their autonomy has been stripped away. Individual Thebans are encouraged to go and wrestle these Spartans in a sort of friendly way, obviously, because there's a Spartan garrison. You can go and challenge these guys to a fight, which is obviously on friendly terms, just to see that you can beat them individually. They're not superhuman. They're not going to be able to win every fight easily. As long as you do a bit of physical training, you're probably up to the task. And this kind of picture is really confirmed by the Spartan king Demaratus in Herodotus, when Xerxes challenges him with this idea. He says, I've heard this claim that the Spartans are so superior, but I think actually it's only the Persians who would be able to fight against more than their own number. Obviously, this is something that's going to be bitterly ironic later on when Xerxes' troops encounter the Spartans. But interestingly, Demaratus himself, king of Sparta, in exile and has fled to the Persian court, denies that a single Spartan like himself would be able to fight more than one man, would be able to be easily superior to any elite Persian fighter. He says, I myself do not promise that I can fight with 10 men or with 2, and I would not even willingly fight with 1. But, he says, if it were necessary, or if some great contest spurred me, I would most gladly fight with one of those men, those Persians, who claim to be each a match for 3 Greeks. So it is with the Spartans, he explains to Xerxes. Fighting singly, they're as brave as any man living, but not more so. But together, they are the best warriors on earth. And that's kind of the principle that comes out of this Spartan training, not their upbringing, not the idea of the way that they are trained to fight, but rather this indoctrination in Spartan values. And this is something that I want to sort of cover really briefly as we come to the end. This idea of why do the Spartans actually win battles? What is it then, if it isn't this superiority that is born out of a lifetime of training for fighting and for war? What is it that they do that makes them superior to others in battles, that allows them so reliably to win? Well, one aspect that's clearly relevant, although its relevance can be easily overstated, is that they are generally fit. Other Greeks also like to go to the gymnasium and do sports and stay fit, but most of the population probably can't afford it. In Sparta, they have to do it. They grow up doing it. And so to some extent, the population is going to be fitter and healthier, which is what Xenophon says. So each individual recruit may well be better suited to this fight than the militia that's called up from a random Greek city-state. But much more important than that is the fact that the Spartans pay much more attention to the organization of their forces. They have an officer hierarchy, they have a clear camp structure, they are prepared for certain eventualities in war that other states are kind of handling as they go. They don't have this same level of unit articulation that allows them to easily march and draw up the army as the Spartans do very quickly. This Spartan formation that Xenophon explains, he has to explain it because other states don't have it. And secondly, very importantly, and this is something that we've already seen in these modern accounts, is the intimidation factor. Because the Spartans were known to specialize and because they kind of doubled down on their reputation as great warriors, other people are indeed afraid of them. And when you see them coming at you with their long hair, which other Greeks have sort of long since abandoned, with their uniform cloaks, with their shiny bronze shields, and they're marching quietly in step, which other Greeks can't do, you get scared. And there are several battles, in fact, at least 4 that I know of, where the enemies of Sparta don't actually let it come to a fight at all. They run away before contact, which means that essentially the Spartans win the battle without having to prove that they're actually better fighters. They don't have to prove that they are better soldiers in individual combat or collectively, because the enemy doesn't want to let it come to that. The enemy decides, no, actually, I'm not going to risk this. I'm out of here. That's an easy way for the Spartans to get a reputation for always winning battles. But of course, that is very intentionally reinforced. The Spartans want battles to go that way because that's the easiest way to win. It also means you don't actually have to put your skills or your supposed superiority to the test. And finally, and this is what I've just covered with this Xenophon quote, is this idea of basic infantry drill. This idea that they can form up information, they can march in step, and they can make basic maneuvers on the battlefield, which other Greeks simply can't. And that's the important thing. Other Greeks receive no training. Now, I could elaborate on this, but I'm already out of time. I'm going to keep this very short. But the very simple point is that other Greek militias are called up on the day of war, essentially, and receive no collective training whatsoever. The fact that the Spartans have done some of this together and start doing more of it when they start campaigning, when the army gathers for war, means that they're able to perform simple maneuvers that are beyond other states. And that is what consistently allows them to win these pitched battles. Even the most basic maneuvers will easily overwhelm a force that has no sense of how these things are carried out. And this proves, as Aristotle says, a very fragile advantage, something that is easily copied and replaced and taken away from them. He says, looking back, as I said, on the period when Spartans had fallen from their position of supremacy, and they'd lost many battles and had been reduced to a small rump state. He says, we know of the Spartans that while they persisted by themselves in their hard exercises, they surpassed all others. But now they're left behind by the rest, both in the gymnastic and in military contests. For they used to stand out not because they exercised their young men like this, but only because they trained and others did not. And that's the important distinction. The Spartans do some training, others do none. And even if that training isn't expressly military and dedicated to this one idea, it's still better than what the others are doing, which is essentially just show up and hope for the best. But now they have their rivals in their education while they had none before. And so this is basically what I think this idea of the Spartan super soldier comes from. Ancient authors are telling us Spartan success is due to this lifelong dedication to warfare, this warlike education that all the Spartans received from childhood. We read that and we run away with it. When we think military training, we think of full-time dedicated military training like the professionals of our own day. Constant exercises, constant training, constant rehearsal, constant study of all the things you need to know in order to fight well. We think of weapon proficiency in particular. We think it's important to learn how to use your weapons, and we think of soldiering as containing a lot of technical skill. We think that you need to understand how certain things work, how machines work, how weapons are used, how your body works, how all these kinds of features that we understand now as a feature, as a factor in effective soldiering. But what the ancients actually meant is something much simpler than that. What the Spartans had was essentially no more than semi-regular physical exercise, just fitness, just a general level of health that is created, and fitness and endurance that is created by just doing sports regularly, but all together. More important than that, moral conditioning, the idea that the Spartans were indoctrinated from youth to be obedient, to be deferent to their leaders, to put the benefits of the community before themselves. This moral indoctrination is a much bigger factor in their upbringing and in the warlike nature of that upbringing than any kind of tactical skill or weapon proficiency. And finally, the idea that, of course, some of that training is always going to be better than what the other Greeks were doing, which is none. We have to see this in relative terms. Spartans are only super soldiers if no one else is a soldier. As soon as others are soldiers too, the Spartans are immediately outclassed. Thank you.